What I'm going to be talking about this morning, as Danny said, is some work we did for RERDIC, looking at issues to do with long-term planning for transport infrastructure and agriculture. This is a long-standing issue, and probably everyone in agriculture understands the importance of transport. I mean, basically transport's the thing that finishes the product, right? You haven't actually finished growing it, in a sense, until you've got it to the consumer, whoever that consumer happens to be. And about 17 years ago, in 1995, there was a big piece of research done in the government, the National Transport Planning Task Force. They did this building, what do they call it? Building for the Job, looking at the future of infrastructure in Australia. And I guess the fact that 17 years on, we're still talking about the same issues, tells you something about infrastructure planning in this country. It's not something, in a sense, that we ever finish. It's an ongoing conversation that we need to have. What's the objective? What is it that, that the agriculture sector needs to think about when it comes to infrastructure planning? And the most important thing and the key thing is to ensure that agricultural needs are integrated into the overall picture of transport infrastructure planning, and in fact infrastructure planning in general. And in particular making sure that agriculture's unique needs are heard. Now, infrastructure planning is actually a really hard thing to do, because you have to plan now and put in place now big investments that have to last for 25, 30, 40 years. And planners, I reckon, always suffer from the what I call the desalination effect, the fear that after you've done it, in 10 years' time, if you've got it wrong, you're going to look like idiots. So the desalination effect is, of course, that Sydney's desal plant is now operating at the same time that the Warragamba Dam is overflowing. So that looks like a silly decision, but the point is, it's easy for decisions to look silly after the fact. The question is, was the planning done correctly and appropriately before the fact? Now, that's the big challenge in infrastructure planning. It's not easy. I always think about it as having three main components: who's responsible for doing it, how do you do it, and who pays, in particular who pays for the infrastructure. Now, in Australia, who's responsible, as Danny said at the introduction, is quite complicated. We've got many levels of government, many departments involved in the broad picture of infrastructure planning. So it's really important that there's a lot of communication between those different departments and some of the key players in the agricultural sector. Now, at the moment, I detect a real willingness actually for the various players to discuss a lot of these agricultural issues, agricultural transport issues. So there's a great opportunity, I think, for some of the key players, the key researchers, the key peak bodies within agriculture to engage in that conversation. The who pays question is a complicated question, and it always is in Australia. The sort of user pays type questions versus public good questions and so on. What I want to focus on mostly today, though, is the question of how do we go about doing it? How do we effectively go about planning future infrastructure needs, excuse me, in order to make sure that the needs of the agricultural sector are taken into account. So again, with the same starting point in mind, I often tend to think of this as involving really four main tasks. The first one is to understand what's going on now, understand the picture of freight flows in the country now, because it's pretty hard to work out what to do next if you're not entirely sure, or you don't have a good picture of what's going on now. The second one is to understand how these flows may change, particularly in the near future, but more importantly in the longer term, because as I said, these infrastructure assets are with us for a very long time. Fourth, to examine the gaps between what we have now and where we think we'd like to be. And then fifth, to identify priorities and then go about funding them. So a fairly standard strategic planning type framework there. Now, there's some big challenges here, because in understanding current freight flows, there is some serious data limitations. In fact, there's very little data about at the moment that would let you build a systematic picture. However, the good news is that there's a lot of work underway at the moment to remedy this problem. The The Australian Bureau of Statistics, along with a number of other organisations, have an Australian Transport Data Action Network where they're looking at getting this information together in a more timely fashion. So that's an important move forward, I think, because it is something that limits our ability to make sensible judgments at the moment. Understanding how and why these things may change is about understanding the drivers of the demand for transport in agriculture. What are the factors that we can think determine that demand, and then building some scenarios around that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that scenario process in a moment. Finally, examining the gaps and identifying priorities. We report in our report here some cases where people have at the moment identified some big gaps. There's some complaints out there in the agricultural sector about infrastructure transport. But on the positive side, I think there's also a lot of work going on in the Department of Infrastructure and Transport and within the Bureau in that department, looking at building more effective and more useful infrastructure planning models. And this is again an opportunity for the agricultural sector to feed in their particular needs into those models so that the planning becomes more integrated. So let's think now in a bit more detail about the sort of process of planning, understanding the drivers of transport demand. Now, when we looked at it, we sort of divided this roughly into 5 main drivers. These are all sort of summary ways of looking at different aspects. The most obvious one is the location of production. Where is something being produced in Australia? That's going to have a big impact on transport demand, relative to the location of the various destination markets, whether they be in Australia or overseas. Thirdly, obviously the volume of production, the sheer magnitude of the transport task is important to the infrastructure we may need to develop. Fourth one is the volume of exports, which is really just another way of talking about the location of destination markets, but the relative share of exports versus domestic consumption in Australia has a big impact on infrastructure demands, because that's a story of whether you're going directly to a port to get something out of the country or whether you're going to an urban fringe, essentially, in order to deliver things to domestic consumption in Australia, which is basically the capital cities. 2 very different sets of infrastructure needs, or in the future potentially. And then finally, of course, what is it we're trying to transport? If we're talking about bulk commodities, bulk grains, livestock and so on, that's a different sort of transport task to if we're talking about a lot of horticultural products or a lot of specialist products or a lot of forest products, for example. So the nature of those products that we're looking at transporting will have an important influence on how we plan for infrastructure. Now, we had a look across the literature at all the various forecasts that people have done really over the last 10 years, looking at the future shape of the agricultural sector, and we found about 10 factors that we think are pretty well driving some of these. Now, I should say that what I'm looking at here is a lot of supply side factors. Clearly, the sorts of demand factors that David and Steve were talking about before will also feed back, but I'm looking at the moment from the supply side to see whether we can do sensible planning from what we know about the drivers essentially of these 5 factors here: location, destination, volumes and so on. So one of the big ones that always comes up when you're talking about agriculture, and particularly spatial location of agriculture, is climate change. The session after this one, I believe, talking about climate adaptation. A lot of people have had a go at forecasting what climate change means for agriculture. Clearly it affects just about all of these factors. And it's not only climate change in Australia, that will affect our ability to supply particular products from particular regions, but also global climate change could substantively affect the sorts of demands that we're facing, which will feed back into the nature of products and how much exporting we're doing, basically. So climate change is a big one, highly uncertain, so I'll talk for a moment about how we deal with that uncertainty. Another big factor that was before the drought, a really, really important issue in Australia was the question of salinity. Now that question in recent years has gone away a little bit, but it may well come back with the way in which our water tables are changing at the moment. And salinity also has quite a large potential influence on the location of production, because it effectively takes some areas out of production, and also the nature of the products, the relative mix of products is influenced by salinity. Obviously population growth, and in particular Australia's population and economic growth relative to that of our trading partners. So in one sense, if our population growth grows a lot more strongly than that of our main trading partners, then we have a change in the export share, the export mix, and vice versa. The nature of economic growth, of income growth in our trading partners will influence the type of product we're wanting to produce. So the typical trend is that as countries become richer, they want more high-end protein, meat for example, so that will have a large influence on the commodity mix that we're likely to be wanting to produce from Australia. Three other factors. One is this question of northern agriculture, so that is influenced both by climate change but by also water availability and other factors. Very controversial. Some people see a huge future for lots of agriculture in the north. So this is both in the north of Western Australia and the north of the east half of Australia. Some people see a lot of potential because there's going to be apparently a lot of water there. Other people see it's very difficult because the disease burden, the pests and so on are very, very different to what we have in the temperate regions. But clearly if northern agriculture does take off, that has a significant, will provide a significant impetus for infrastructure changes. Biofuels demand. Now that's something that interest in waxes and wanes a lot, but we've seen in recent years biofuels demand significantly affecting the structure of agriculture in various economies around the world, countries like Brazil, for example. So in Australia, there's some interesting questions about what biofuels might mean for the structure of our production. And GM crops. So GM, genetically modified crops, again a controversial issue, but something that has the potential to substantively change productivity in Australia and potentially the structure of production. So all things that are going to feed into some of the factors that are likely to determine the location and nature of production and will therefore determine the transport demand.